Hey there, what's up? The recording didn't work. I had some audio issues. Not really sure what it was, but this should be good. We'll just redo the lecture real quick while y'all are working on the studio. I think that should work out pretty good. Cool. So building objects, learning all about classes in JavaScript. Story time. So in a solar system far, far away, as a scientist, you wake up on an unfamiliar planet after a 470-year light journey in a cryogenic stasis. The small world resembles a large overgrown garden. Your first mission is to catalog and classify all of its unique life forms. Faced with the task of naming each creature, you seek a more organized approach. After much thought, you devise a data-structured model, modeled after the animal kingdom. So, right, like we see on the right side, providing a systematic way to document and understand the strange life forms on this new world. So in the graphic to the right, we see an example of inheritance, which we'll talk about later. But essentially, we start off with something called creature, and it has two properties, which is name and classification. Underneath creature, we have mammal, which inherits the name and classification properties. In addition to that, it adds the fur property. And then canine inherits mammal, which inherits everything the mammal has, which is name, classification, and fur, and it adds on breed. Then now below this, we have instances of those classes. So objects created with that class information from a programming sense, which is like space dog, space fox, etc. So anyways, a few days pass and you are running out of pages. You brought 32 notebooks with you, but it definitely was not enough. So your new mission is now to code a program for documenting all these creatures on this planet. Right, so the workbook Jill went through before the class essentially just covered classes. So it covered creating a class, assigning methods, and then also inheritance. So before we start talking about classes, I want to start with objects. They're very relevant to what we're talking about. So as we know, an object essentially allows us to structure data. It doesn't give us any special tools. It doesn't allow us to do things like a loop will like run code a bunch of times. A function will run code every time we call it. An if statement does its own thing. But an object, its one goal is just to help us organize our data, organize our methods, etc. And so with that, you can see an example of a couple different objects. So we have these different car objects. They all have the same properties. They all have a copy of the same function. And so that introduces why we might want to care about using a class. So to really simplify what a class is, a class creates an object. Classes create objects. And so what if, instead of writing all those car objects that we saw in the previous slide, we were able to have a tool that would generate those classes for us. And so essentially a class is going to be our blueprint for creating objects. So thinking back to the previous example, we're going to look at how we could refactor this and use a class to create these objects instead. So here we have a class called car, and the car has a constructor which takes in 3 different values and assigns them to 3 different properties, make, model, and year. Car also has a method. The method is called getDescription, and it returns a string. And so here we have 3 different instances of the string. Of the car object. I'm saying this wrong. We have 3 different objects created with the car class. And so these 3 different objects are going to have the same types of properties, the same description method, but the properties are going to be set to their own values. And essentially, it's really the same as these variables right here, except that they're created differently. Instead of hard coding them, we're using a class to create them. So building on the idea, okay, well, a class will create an object, we can also use classes as blueprints for classes. And so this is where the idea of inheritance comes in. So here we have two different classes. We have the vehicle class, and then we have the car class. The vehicle class, the way we've coded it, it starts off with 3 properties and starts off with a description method. The car class extends the vehicle class. Another way to say it is it's importing the vehicle class. And so it's the most probably correct way to say it is it's inheriting the vehicle class because it's inheriting the properties and it's inheriting the methods. And so here our constructor looks a little bit different. So we're going to override vehicles constructor, but we're going to take vehicles 3 properties, make, model, and year. We're going to set those, and we're going to add on one more property using the this keyword, which is doors. So now we have make, model, year, and doors. Also, in this example, we're overriding the get description function, but more about that later. So finally, we create a new car object using the car class. And so to reiterate, essentially, that very last line of code, all we have there is an object. But the way the object was created was with this crazy class syntax. So to summarize, we have objects for structuring data, sort of as a blueprint for structuring data. Then we have classes for creating these objects. And then classes can inherit other classes. And that sort of, it just expands the level of complexity or the level of abstraction when it comes to data structuring. So JavaScript is not known for its use of classes. And so while you might not see a lot of classes in JavaScript code, we will see it quite a bit in the future. So the next really big time that we're going to be dealing with classes is when we learn the Angular framework for JavaScript. And so that will be in classes 18, 19, and 20. Angular uses the idea of classes in its code. Also Java, in Unit 2, we're going to be focused a lot on Java, and Java is all about classes, and it's not alone in that. Basically, every major programming language heavily relies on classes. JavaScript's pretty unique in the fact that it doesn't use classes very much. Cool. So that's sort of the theory. Let's talk about how to make a class. Class has 3 key elements: the constructor, the properties, and the methods. So the constructor is essentially that special function that is used to create objects. The properties are like the variables defined in the context of the class, and the methods are like the functions in the context of the class. You'll see the this keyword, and the this keyword is used inside of functions, and it's used inside of functions to refer to the properties of the object. So we've seen that this keyword used is just referring to a property inside of the class or the object. Cool. So let's do a quick code demo. Since I'm re-recording this, I think a lot of the values are filled in. Right, so while we were live coding this earlier in class, we created the constructor, and we had to basically pass it these two different parameters, right? And we also talked about how the constructor, that's an important keyword. You can't rename it, you can't shorten it, you don't want to put anything in front of it. The constructor is an important keyword. The syntax is very similar to how you write a function, but the key difference being we start with the constructor keyword, and then we move on with very function-like syntax, because constructor is a special function essentially. And so inside of the constructor, we have the name property and the classification property, and we're saying this is the name property of the creature class, and we're setting it to the value we're passing it. All right, so the the left-hand side is the property, and the right-hand side is the value we're passing it through this name parameter. So hypothetically, we could say aardvark equals, and the code would work the same, right? It's very common, though, to see them using the same name for the parameter and the property, but don't let that confuse you. Here we wrote a method that basically returns string. And then here we created a new object. And how we created the new object is we leveraged our creature class. We passed it 2 values. And now we're able to use the properties and the methods inside that object as before. So if we run this, it gives us the output of the get description function. And one thing I really do want to reiterate is I'm going to rewrite spacedog as an object. I mean, they're both objects, but like I'm not going to use a class. So this is not something we did during class, but I thought it would be useful to give an example of here. Comma here, then we have our get description function. I think that's good enough. Let's see if this works the same way. Missing, oh, we're not using equal signs. And then anonymous functions, I'm so used to arrow functions, I'm pretty sure I can just get away with doing it just like this. Right, cool. So now we have our object with 2 properties, name and classification. And then we have a method inside of our object called getDescription. And so if we create the object this way, we're hard coding a lot of information. However, if we create using a class to create the object, then we can create multiple objects like this just using the class itself. Cool. Jumping back into the lesson to talk about inheritance. So one class can inherit another. What is it inheriting? It's inheriting properties and methods. And so the syntax for this is we'll use the extends keyword to extend, or to basically extend the properties and methods of the parent class or the superclass. You can call it a parent class, you can call it a superclass. The language that we're using doesn't matter a whole lot. It's just referring to whatever class that we're importing these properties and values from. So I talked about this keyword. Inside of a class, inside of an object, this is just referring to the context of the class. Super is very similar to this. The only difference is instead of talking about the context of the class we're in, super is talking about the context of the class that we're importing. Cool. So if we are inheriting properties and methods, we can override those methods if we want to change them. And the way we do that is we just create a new method in our subclass and our child class, however you want to say it, create a new method with the exact same name, and it will override whatever method that we inherited. So here's an example of that. We have an animal class, and then we have a dog class, which inherits the properties and methods of the animal class. And since it's inheriting it, we have the eat method, but we want to modify the eat method in this example. And so here, we just add the eat method again, and then we have some other fancy stuff going on by referencing the inherited eat method. Cool. So here we have our final demo. And once again, we already went through this during class, so a lot of the code has already been written, but we'll go ahead and read through the code here. So here is the creature class that we built earlier. We've already talked about this. We have 2 properties and a method. Here, the canine class inherits using this extends keyword. That's important. I want to notice that. Using the extends keyword, we're inheriting all of the properties and methods of creature. And so in our constructor, we need to mention all of these different properties because we need to set the properties when we create a new object using the canine class. And so we can set these new properties as we did before, but to set the properties that we inherited, we need to call the superclass's constructor. And so we do it right here. We pass in name and classification. And so we're essentially setting these 2 properties right here. One thing that got brought up in class is like, well, what happens if you don't have a constructor in the canine class? Well, if we don't have the constructor in the canine class, then we're never overriding this constructor. So it will just default to using this constructor. And so then when we create a new instance of the canine class, when we create a new object, it'll have these 2 properties. But since we want to add on more properties, we need to override the constructor method to add on these 2 new properties. Once again, we're overriding the getDescription method, and we're doing something fancy here. And what we're doing is we're calling the superclass's getDescription method, this string right here, and then we're just adding on some more stuff to the string. So we want to mention our new properties about the canine, that it's a specific breed and it has a certain length of hair. And so let's run the code so we can see what that now looks like. So now we have the original message, but we've been able to add on this other sentence here, which is it's a Chinese crested and it has short hair. So that's kind of cool. Now, the last thing that really needs to be reinforced here is the difference between this and super. So I added another method in this example. As a reminder, we're still inside of the canine class. And the method references this getDescription. But how does the code know which getDescription to use? Is it going to use the one in the canine class, or is it going to use the getDescription method from the inherited getDescription method? The way the code knows which one to use is either we're going to say this to refer to the canine class, or we will say super to refer to the creature class. And so if we say super and we were to call this method, it's going to reference this method. Here, if we change it to this and we call this method, it's now going to reference the method internal to the class. So, right, cool. So we covered a lot of information. The key thing to remember is that even though there's a lot of new syntax going on here, this is the whole idea of classes is something that you're definitely going to use in the future. And the class, in the end, it is just it's a fancy way to give you the structure to create a new object. Right. So that covers it for the bit of the lesson about classes. This evening we also talked about HTML because we had some extra time. So I'll go ahead and do that here. Right, so I'm using a website called CodePen. This is not part of the official LaunchCode material, but I use it personally because I can mash out ideas and examples pretty quickly. Right, so here, the top part, this is my HTML code. And here in the bottom part is rendering what the web page would look like from that HTML. And so this is my code editor on top, and the bottom is like my web page output. And to give a better visual example of that, if you were to create just an HTML file and put this text in it, you could open up that HTML file in your browser and it would look like just like this output below. Right, so let's talk about this. Let's talk about this syntax right here. So this right here is called an element. This is an H1 element. So the element has an opening tag and a closing tag. Inside of the opening and closing tag, we have the contents of the element. And we can nest elements inside of other elements. Notice that we have the slash on our closing tag. So we just created a new element. It has an opening tag and a closing tag. And this element, the content of it, includes all of that. So hypothetically, let's say H2. Right. So the H1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elements are interesting because they just give us text, and they depending on the number, it depends on how big it's going to render the text. So here we have this web page. It has 4 elements. It has the div element, and the div element contains all of these H elements. Sorry, it keeps jumping down on me. I'm not sure why it does that. And so the H element here is made up of an opening tag, closing tag, and the content in between. Once again, opening tag, closing tag, content in between. And so there's a lot more to know about HTML, plenty to explore. Hopefully we'll have time to talk about in the next lesson. That is one of the things that we're intended to cover next Thursday. But hopefully this little refresher or little introduction is helpful as you start building context. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you probably in a little bit for Studio.